All right, well today what I'd like to do is just go over a few more, one more concept that relates to self-organization. Then I would like to shift all this into the human realm because I think that's what we've been working up to. At least that was my intent to work up to. The question becomes, why do differing ecosystems have different levels of self-organization? There's a number of reasons for this. And these are what I call factors that foster self-organization. And so we're going to go through those. There's a few of these that really become instructive, especially for when we're looking at human systems. So everything being the same, if you have two pretty much identical ecosystems, everything is being the same, if you enhance one aspect in one of those ecosystems that could raise species richness and self-organization, any ideas what that might be? There's a number of
energy input.
Not necessarily. It's not energy input. So we can look at, our salt marshes, which are very productive in energy input, but their level of self-organization not as high as some other systems that aren't as high. So it's ironic, but it's not the energy input itself.
It's not heat or sunlight.
Well, it's related, but it's not directly heat or sunlight or energy input, but it is definitely related to heat, sunlight.
Latitude.
You're getting closer, but not just the latitude itself. What is the latitude doing? That's the key.
Photo period?
Not photo period. Although that could be a factor. But there's something broader here.
Variation in photo period.
Okay, variation in the physical environment. So if you have physical stability, if your environment is physically stable, you're going to have higher levels of species richness than if it's unstable. So a way to visualize this, let's say you're an ecosystem researcher, and you've applied for grants. You've gotten 2 grants for 1 year's doing 1 year's worth of research up in Baffin Island, way up in high latitudes in Canada, and 1 year's worth of research down, let's say, on Hawaii, on the coast of Hawaii. I want you to think about, like, now you're camping and you have to bring all of your equipment. I'd like you to think about what you're going to be taking up for a year-long expedition up to Baffin Island. Just think about the clothing. You're going to have, big muckluts and mitts and huge parkas and, heavy pants. But that's just for the wintertime. Then the summer you need all your mosquito netting, and you need rubber boots when the permafrost starts thawing on the surface. And you have all this stuff. You're going to take trunks of clothing up. But if you're going to Hawaii, you might make it with just a carry-on bag for the year. You might have
One
couple pairs of shorts, t-shirts, sun hat, bathing suit, sandals. That could get you through. And the reason is that Hawaii has a very stable physical environment. Temperature fluctuations not that great over the whole year. Humidity levels fairly constant. Photo periods fairly constant. But you go up to Baffin Island, and you have these dramatic fluctuations where it can be completely dark for months at a time, then completely light for months at a time. You can have these dramatic temperature ranges from minus 70 degrees up to 80 degrees. Periods where water is absolutely frozen, periods where it's not. And so that analogy I used of clothing is sort of analogous to a species niche. If you're in a very stable environment, your niches can be small. You don't need a lot of adaptations to your physical environment. And if you have small niches, it means you can pack more species in. It also means you can probably get by with smaller populations because the chance of extinction events is much, much lower. But if you're up in a place like the Arctic that's very unstable, you have to have big niches. You have to be able to tolerate huge changes throughout the year. And you need to exist in larger populations where those perturbations can have big impacts on population numbers. So up in these unstable physical environments, you have large niches, large populations, meaning fewer species. So yeah, everything being the same, whenever there's more physical stability in ecosystems, you're going to see greater arrays of species richness and self-organization. So that's one of them. There's a bunch here, so let's see if we can get another one.
And then it's a lot about economic constancy or some other flow of disturbance.
Okay, so disturbance is one. So this is going to come under the category of low levels of competitive exclusion. Competitive exclusion is when in an ecosystem you have, a species that's very competitive, and in that way forces other species out of the system. So, if we go over to Pisgah State Park, over across the river, where we find, probably the largest chunk of our oldest forests in the region, we find lots and lots of hemlock. Hemlock is a species that once it establishes is incredibly competitively exclusive. It has the highest tolerance for shade, so it produces these very dense shady forests. It lays down a needle bed that restricts germination and establishment of a lot of species, and it lives for a great age. So once hemlock starts moving in, if you don't have a disturbance or something, it starts really increasing its numbers, and the numbers of other species in the system start going down because of competitive exclusion. So one way to keep competitive exclusion low is through intermediate levels of disturbance. So too frequent disturbance regime can suppress the number of species, and actually having no disturbance regime will suppress numbers of species. So, you could look at, let's say, a sand dune where people get excited about tromping around on. If you get lots and lots of people walking on that sand dune, that disturbance level is so great, it can actually eradicate the ecosystem because it's just too frequent a disturbance regime. However, if we took Pisgah, let's say we put we put a big plexiglass dome over that western side of the park that has an older forest in it, and we didn't allow any disturbance in there at all. No wind disturbance, no fire, no logging, no pathogens, no snow and ice storms, nothing. What would happen is through time, hemlock would take over that whole system. And because of that, because of competitive exclusion, our species richness would plummet. So intermediate levels of disturbance are sort of just right to keep competitive exclusion suppressed, but not so much to eradicate other species. So when I was writing The Myth of Progress, I wanted to use Goldilocks and the Three Bears as a way to explain this. And my wife Marcia, who was editing, said, the book's too serious. You can't do that. You can't do that. But she's not here, so I can do it. But, I mean, you could say that too much disturbance would be like the Papa Bear's bed. It's too hard, and therefore restricts self-organization. Too little disturbance would be like the Mama Bear's bed. It's too soft. But intermediate disturbance would be like the Big Bear's bed. It's just right. It's right in the intermediate zone. Now, there is another way, besides intermediate disturbance, that can also suppress competitive exclusion. Any ideas what that might be? Well, it is related to predators, what's called keystone predators. So, a keystone predator is a predator that basically keeps competitive exclusion at bay. So the first really good study done on this was done in tide pools in the Pacific Northwest. And this researcher, Payne, was noticing the major predator of mollusks and bivalves in these tide pools was the ochre sea star. So if you've ever been out in the Pacific Northwest, these are these great big sea stars that come in a number of different color forms, red, orange, purple, brown. So what he did was he thought, well, gee, what if I exclude these sea stars from the tide pools? What's going to happen? So a number of tide pools, he kept on a daily basis removing the sea stars. Other tide pools, he let them forage in. And what he found in about a month's time, with those tide pools he kept the sea stars out of, the species richness of mollusks dropped from 14 species to 7. And one of the species, the Californian mussel, sort of exploded and took over large portions of that tide pool. So what he realized was that the sea stars were suppressing the competitive exclusion of the Californian mussel, allowing a much more robust system. So again, keystone predators could be another way of distributing.
So would that be wolf and elk?
Yeah, wolf and elk. So, you know, in areas out in the west where we had reduction of and elimination of wolf population, elk populations increased, and what we saw at the same time was dramatic decreases in species richness of the flora there because there was just too much browsing pressure. So yeah, they would be like that as well. All right, how about something else besides physical stability or low levels of competitive exclusion? Everything being the same, if one ecosystem had this, that would boost its self-organization. All right, so this is one reason that our salt marshes have low species richness. Something's missing in them.
Physical structure.
Exactly, physical structure. So all things being the same, if one ecosystem has more structure, it's going to have higher levels of self-organization because what that structure produces are all these microenvironments that species can specialize to. So as you develop that structure, boy, things come in. So in a lot of ecosystems develop their own structures. So if you look at coral reefs, as those reefs are developing, they're making their own structure. You go into the reef versus an adjacent, let's say, sandy bottom lagoon, and the differences are striking. In the reef, there are just so many more fish and invertebrate species, and they're specializing in all those microenvironments. Some of the fish are just stratifying at different levels. Some are specialized, particular corals. Some live in corals. Some live on them. You know, there's all these ways, these niches available to them because of the structure. But once you get out in that sandy lagoon floor, your only structure is that sandy bottom, and that really limits the type of sorts of microenvironments that species can specialize to.
The salt marsh is what in this structure?
Exactly. So in the salt marsh, you have this very homogeneous structure. You don't have that physical structure that would boost that species richness, and that's one of the reasons, even though it's very productive, it has somewhat low species richness and self-organization, because there are just not all those microenvironments that you can find in a more physically heterogeneous system. Anything else people can do? These are the big three I wanted to get out, because these ones really do apply very much to human systems, but there are others. But any other thoughts on this? All right, one other I'll mention, just because it's important to all this, is just evolutionary time. The longer an ecosystem has been in existence, the more time there's for coevolution. And because of that, you're going to get more specialization in integration. So just, evolutionary time. Now, and also I should mention, two that I'll just put in here are, well, let's put down here area as well. That's another important one. All things being the same, two ecosystems are similar. One that's a bigger chunk of area is going to hold more species. And there's a rough rule of thumb here. If you increase tenfold the size of an ecosystem, a rough rule of thumb is you might expect to double the number of species in it in that way. So these are all important ones. I'd say these three up here are the ones that are probably most pertinent to human systems. But if you look at equatorial tropics, which probably have our highest species richness of any of our ecosystems on the planet, they have all of this going for them, all these things. Physically stable, they're incredibly stable. They're if you're out on the equatorial equator, temperature regimes are maybe fluctuating 10 to 15 degrees max throughout the year. That's really stable. As on the equator, you have, basically 12 hours of sunlight, 12 hours of darkness. You have humidity levels around 100% year-round. Very, very physically stable. They generate their own intermediate disturbance regime. So in the canopy of tropical rainforests, because there's so much photosynthesis going on, and the canopies are so dense, that light and carbon dioxide become really limited. So if any tree can punch through that canopy and become what's called a super canopy tree and get up above it, all of a sudden it gets this huge amount of additional light and carbon dioxide. And these super canopy trees quickly become festooned in all these epiphytes, plants that grow on other plants. So they get covered in lianas and bromeliads and orchids and all sorts of stuff. And the sheer weight of that stuff after, basically 50 to 100 years gets so heavy it can bring those super canopy trees right down. And they're connected via vines to lots of surrounding trees, so it opens up these gaps. And of course, that allows all the early successional species that need a lot of light to come in. So the tropical rainforest generates its own intermediate disturbance regime through these super canopy trees. They generate, like coral reefs, a dramatic amount of physical structure as those forests develop. They have been intact for about 60 million years. Through the perturbations we've had due to our various glacial events I was talking about in the first class, there have always been chunks of refugia of intact tropical rainforests that have always been there. So they've had all that evolutionary time while our temperate systems up here are constantly being disrupted by these glaciation events. And historically, they covered huge land masses all around the equator of the globe. So they had all this going for them, one of the reasons they have really high levels of species richness. Now, going to these three up here, these I'm mentioning because if you can take a human system and enhance any of these in that system, you're going to boost its self-organization. So I'll give you 3 examples I'm going to work with. I'll use an example of an advertising agency, let's say a school classroom, and let's say a neighborhood. And we're going to look at each one of these and each of those. So physical stability, in this case, I'm not going to talk so much about, physical is important, but also thinking about emotional stability. So we can start with, let's say, a classroom. If children in a classroom that, is not physically stable, the temperature getting really hot or really cold, or even more importantly, that is not emotionally stable, if they feel at risk for any reason, through bullying or whatever else, learning and sort of the interactions in that learning environment are going to go down. But if you can enhance the physical stability, emotional stability in a classroom setting where children really feel safe and feel that they can voice what they're thinking and everything else, you're going to get much more integration and much higher levels of learning. Let's think of an advertising agency. I want to think of 2 advertising agencies that are completely similar. Maybe each have 100 employees. Their mission is to generate as many advertising ideas as they can. In one of them, you have a very even-keeled CEO, where you know where that person stands. You know that you can state your opinion, and you're not going to, regardless of how crazy it might seem, it won't be rejected. But in the other, you have a CEO that's really erratic. One day giving you praise, the next day out of nowhere belittling you, and people don't know where this person's coming from. And so what happens is they tend to clam up. And the free flow of ideas goes down because people are threatened to sort of get their ideas out. So, physical stability or emotional stability, whenever you can bring it into a situation, is going to enhance how that system functions in its integration. Low levels of competitive exclusion. Same thing. Think of a classroom where a teacher is very aware of student participation, and any students that are really dominating discussions or whatever else, that teacher has a means to keep them sort of in check, to leave a lot more open space for other children that maybe aren't as aggressive in getting their ideas out there. And because of that, you get this greater diversity of ideas and learning. Or again, an advertising agency where in one, there are no rules of engagement. You know, people come to the table, and if you've got someone who's really aggressive and dominates the conversation, they may dominate it. In another ad agency, they might have rules that state, you know, they might have a facilitator who's actually timing and saying, you know, everyone has a minute here. And if they go with a minute, the facilitator comes in and says, you know, you're over your minute, somebody else. That would be sort of like almost like a Keystone predator, keeping that really competitive individual in check. Physical structure, whenever we can enhance this, you're going to do it. So think of two ad agencies. One where they just have 100 cubicles all lined up, and each individual is in their own cubicle doing their work in isolation. Or another one, well, there's cubicles where you can go to work on your own if you want to, but there's conference rooms of different sizes, some that are intimate, maybe only for a party of 6, others larger that might hold 14. Maybe there's even a recreational area with pool tables where people can shoot pool, and people can assign themselves where they want. That ad agency with all that additional physical structure, not the homogeneity of all those cubicles, is probably going to have much greater idea of diversity ideas, because now you have all these different ways that people can integrate the physical structure. Same thing in a classroom where children are just at rows of desks versus a classroom that really has various areas in it where different types of learning can take place, maybe a manipulatives area, an area where students can work in groups, areas where they can work independently. Oh, I completely forgot about the neighborhood. Well, let's use this one for the neighborhood. Think of a neighborhood where all you have are houses all on their 1 acre lot. So you have 100 acres, 100 houses all on 1 acre lots. Pretty homogeneous structure. Or you have another sort of community where the houses are clustered quite close together, maybe on 25 acres, but the other 75 acres is common space for everybody. So there's, you know, maybe a bike path through there. Maybe there's even a pond where in the winter people can go skating. Maybe there's a pavilion down the pond where people can gather and have fires in the winter or whatever else. Because of that structure, you're going to get a lot more interaction between the people in that community than one where everyone's just in their own acre lot. So this is just an example of how if we start thinking about these things and integrating them into our human systems, we can actually enhance the nature of the integration that happens in ways that create a more self-organized human system. So any questions or comments about that?
Self-organization in this, while you see it as a benign thing, it's very benign.
Seen as actually a good thing.
Yeah.
Exactly. In other words, it doesn't really matter what the goal is, what the organization is. If you put these in, it's going to enhance it. That's all. Yeah, there's not a goal here. It's just saying this will enhance what's happening. So the question is, how do you keep the stability in place when you have a system that's growing or developing? So I think in the very first session we talked about during the anti-entropic phase of a system, when it's growing, it can self-organize, and that happens through self-reinforcing positive feedback loops, which can bring it to a new level of organization. Well, each time that happens, you are disrupting the previous stability and has to restabilize. So in developmental periods, you don't necessarily want to have a static stability because that's just going to keep that development from taking place. But once you get to a new level, if you can restabilize, you can make that level function quite well until you're ready for another sort of, sort of step upward.
The question I have has to do with evolutionary time. How does that relate to human self-organization? Because you go back in time, and it seemed to be in some ways there was more self-organization, on a smaller scale, villages and tribes and so on and so forth, than here we are now. So what's happened with evolutionary time as it affects the human species?
Yeah, well, I'd say we're going to get there in just a bit. We're starting to go back the other way. We're not starting. We have been going back. Again, self-organization in a lot of our systems for a while. Other ones have been self-organizing. So it still plays out. We're looking at time being a factor here. It can, if a system is self-organizing, a human system, through time it'll get more self-organized, so it does relate. But also there can be counter forces that work against it, and that's what we'll talk about very shortly in our own situation.
Just a quick question, going back to the tropical forest. There's been a lot of disturbance, obviously, in the tropical forest. Are there places where they've tried to regenerate the forest, and how soon has it been able to come back to this kind of self-organization model?
It depends. these smaller levels of disturbance, which the forest has, this, like I was saying, that the forest has evolved with, it regenerates very well. If you start removing large areas of tropical forest, you can actually completely alter the physical environment in ways that makes it very difficult for it to come back. So, two things happen. One of the big things are tropical rainforests have what are called lateritic soils. These are soils that really have no organic material in them, basically, other than living organic material in the form of mycorrhizae and roots, because decomposition rates are so fast there that all that organic material just decomposes very, very quickly. And luckily, because the root system and the mycorrhizae are so efficient, all that stuff is sucked right back up, so it's all up in the living biota. It's not like our soils where, after 80 years of forest development, we have more carbon in the ground in dead material than we have above ground in the trees and everything else. So if you clear out large areas of tropical rainforest, the equatorial sunlight can actually bake those soils and make them really hard to regenerate tropical systems. So when you get a lot of large-scale disturbance, that can be problematic because the system is not co-evolved with that. It's co-evolved with these smaller intermediate disturbances.
I'm thinking about diversity of physical structure. If we were to set aside forests to go ancient all around the Northeast, that would change the diversity of our physical structure. And there's a lot of information out about how to reach our full ecological potential of our landscape, that we need to set aside patches of forest to go old growth. Can you please comment on that?
Yeah, no, that's accurate. Right now, if you look at witness tree surveys that were done when proprietors came up and laid out towns around here, and there's been a lot of research done around this. When proprietors came up and laid out towns, they were laying out 60-acre lots, and the corner of each lot had a witness tree to denote its corner. So you can go in those and you can peruse them, and for a town you can say, all right, here was the mix of tree species we had back in the middle 1700s. If you look at those records compared to what we see today, our forests are much more homogeneous structurally. We had much different ages of forests back then and much greater diversity of different tree species. So within a town, you'd find many different forest types distributed around that town, where today our forests are much more homogeneous in structure and in their species composition. And that's because, pretty much 80% of our forests around here are between basically, 170 years to maybe as little as 50 years of age. So we have basically a 120-year age range there. We're missing a lot of younger forests. We're missing particularly the older forests that can get up to 400-year-old forests. Those are missing. So yes, if we could save areas, and most forest ecologists are saying you need to probably put aside 10% of your forest holdings to be pretty much untouched, to just let it do what it's going to do. Then that would boost the regional physical structure and biotic diversity by doing that. So yeah, that is something that would enhance it in that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, the question is, since we're really learning more about how these ecosystems function on a regular basis, that we still have a long way to go to a full understanding of how these systems work. I mean, we really don't even know their full complexity. I mean, I've heard that if a high school classroom decided they really wanted to do a unit on soils, and they had students going out and investigating soils, there's a very good chance a student would be able to identify a species that's not known to science, right outside their backyard. So these systems we're still, in our understanding phases. So what I was saying when we're out in the field is that the idea that we can do something to improve ecosystem health is sort of a really crazy idea. We don't even completely understand the system. So going out and doing something, is not going to do that. However, that said, I'm not against management. It should be for very clear managing for this, or this, or this, but not just to make a system healthy. that's not necessarily what we follow. So I think, yes, we have, as humans, we have sculpted the ecosystems we live in. There's not one ecosystem in the globe that hasn't been in some way altered by humans. Even those primary tropical rainforests, people have used them in ways that has altered them. But the thing is, if those alterations are sort of low in scale and are within the system, through time, they become co-evolved in the system worships them. So for example, native people here in the Americas use fire a lot to manage ecosystems. And we know that in areas where fire was used frequently as a management tool, those systems evolve with fire, and removal of it can be very disruptive to them. So yeah, there are ways certainly to do that in ways that the system adjusts to through time for these factors. All right, well, that was a good rounded question, so I think we'll hold that there, as I would like to get into some stuff before we're done with that one. So back in the first session, I mentioned that the sort of theoretical body around complex system science was mostly being generated in the middle of the 20th century through these basic conferences that were bringing in researchers from various disciplines who really started talking about what they're seeing in their systems, how they're functioning, and out of this came up this more unified body of complex system science, including the law of self-organization. That's when that was generated. And I should just to reiterate what that is, self-organization is a process that, as a system is in that anti-entropic growth phase, it can self-organize, and if it does, its complexity increases, and that complexity is derived from the parts becoming ever more specialized in time, in tightly integrated fashion, so that each part doing what it needs to do to support itself is creating conditions that support the whole, and as a result, these self-organized systems become increasingly energy efficient, resilient, and stable. So that whole notion came out of the latter part of the 20th century. And yet I'm guessing that Western scientists were probably the last people to come across this idea. That I think indigenous people probably intuited it way before. It actually was written about quite eloquently 200 years before Western science even encountered it. And it was written about by Adam Smith in his book, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776. Now, Smith's considered sort of the father of modern economic theory. And when he was writing The Wealth of Nations, that was pre-industrial society. We had not started tapping into fossil fuels like coal or anything like that. And he was mostly focused on looking at merchant economies. And what intrigued him was what he called the invisible hand of the economy. But if you read him, he is writing about self-organization. What he's saying is, when I'm looking at these merchants, the butcher, the baker, the blacksmith, the brewer, they're all doing what they're doing out of their own self-interest to make money. But without anyone orchestrating it, they're actually in relationships that are mutually beneficial. So, the blacksmith's making knives, which get sold to the butcher. The butcher uses them in his business and then sells meat to the blacksmith and the brewer and the baker. So they're actually, through their own self-interest, servicing each other. But if you look at that sort of system that Smith was looking at, you'll see you're looking at very specialized merchants. The butcher just dealing in meat, the blacksmith just in metal, the brewer just in beer, the baker just in bread. And even though they're all in, let's say, the retail sector, they are in meaningful, supportive relationships with each other. And they're being able to do that because they're not directly competing. Because their specialization, they're all producing, things for sale that the others aren't. And in that way, they don't compete. So it's very much like what we've seen in ecosystems through time as being avoid competition by becoming specialized. They can coexist without having to lose those energy losses. But if you look at our economic system today, you'll see we've shifted way in another direction. That you can look at any of our economic sectors, whether it's agriculture, financial, media, retail, energy, pharmaceuticals, really doesn't matter. You'll see that the bulk of the capital is running through anywhere from maybe 6 to 12 very large corporate entities. And these entities are not specialists. If you look at like a retailer like Walmart, they're selling everything. So they have big niches, not specialized niches. And within their sectors, they're not that interested in integrating with others. They would rather probably outcompete them through competitive exclusion to get more and more market share. And so what that means is, as we move towards greater concentration of function in our various sectors, we've moved away from that decentralization, and as a result, we've moved more towards, towards less resiliency in the system. So this is an issue that we really need to address, and I believe that we need to move back. Now, I'm not saying we get rid of large corporations. I certainly do not believe we ought to get rid of global trade. I think that's important for linking us as a global community. But I think we moved way too far towards consolidation. We need to move back towards more, I guess, enhancement of our regional and local economies with more sort of local regionally based enterprises that are a bit smaller, a bit more specialized, and can find meaningful ways to integrate within their sectors in ways that are more mutually supportive. And this also, by doing that, creates a system that's much more energy efficient. Because when we've gone again towards consolidation, we lose our energy efficiency. So let me just give an example of this. I'd just like you to think about the amount of embedded energy that's going into the making of a hamburger patty. And we're going to look first at McDonald's, and then we're going to look at the People's Pint down in Greenfield, Massachusetts. So McDonald's, the largest producer of hamburger patties in the world, their meat is sourced from pretty much throughout the Americas. You know, Canada, United States, all the way down to Argentina. And so that beef is then shipped to processing centers around the world. So we have processing centers here in this country, but since McDonald's is now a global enterprise, there are processing centers in Europe and Asia and other places. In those processing centers, we have machines that's taking that ground meat, or actually probably taking the beef, grinding the ground beef, weighing it out into prescribed weight of patties, forming the patties, cooking it, cooling it, boxing it, and freezing it. And then those boxes of frozen patties are shipped to distribution centers, and then from distribution centers, they're shipped to the retail stores where they're reheated and sold in hamburgers. So there's a lot of embedded energy there. We're talking about huge amounts of energy from moving meat to those processing centers, oftentimes thousands of miles. Then all the embedded energy in machines that are making those patties, cooking them, freezing them, boxing them. Then again, the energy costs of shipping them to distribution centers, then to the retail stores. So we have an incredible amount of energy, sort of investment there if you're looking at a pound of patties. But if you look at the People's Pint, their beef is sourced from one farm that's 10 miles from them. So that beef is brought in, and then the patties are made by a chef and cooked right there. So the amount of embedded energy in those patties is way, way less than, let's say, per pound, the amount of embedded energy in the McDonald's patties, which are using a lot of energy in this sort of distribution system. Now, I should mention, McDonald's is very profitable. Because of that energy expenditure and mechanization, they can dramatically reduce labor costs. And that's the biggest cost for a business is labor. So they bring down labor costs, they can bring their prices way down, which makes them incredibly competitive in terms of the cost perspective. But the problem is that it's all based on huge amounts of energy input. And of course, we talked about that first session. We have to bring down our use of energy as a global population because it's creating all this biospheric entropy, particularly in the realm of climate change. And so the system we've developed has worked for 150 years to bring prices down, boost standards of living, but you can't get something for nothing, as the second law teaches us. And what it's done, though, it's all been built on the back of using more and more and more energy in that way, creating more and more environmental degradation. Yeah.
Plus, the profits are disappearing from the community.
Well, the profits do go back to large corporate entities, so they don't stay in the community
So
and
that's the-
move around the community as much.
Yeah.
So that is true. But what I'm pointing out here is that as we've gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, which allows us to become mechanized, because if you're small, you really can't afford it. It doesn't really make sense. You get more profitable by reducing your labor costs, but we start to get more and more and more energy intense. And that is a real reason why we've got to move back from the model we've been operating under, because there's no way we can continue in that way. If we keep moving in that direction by trying to embrace the system that's created this environmental degradation, what's going to happen is the feedback is going to start to dismantle that system. So, yeah.
I read something.
Well, I think, okay, so the question is, do we go back, that she's giving her experience of growing up in a farming family and how that was very, very hard life. I mean, they had shelter, they had adequate clothing and food, but they worked very, very hard. And the question is, do we go back to that? And I think it's not an either or. I think we hybridize. I think we take things that have worked in the past and we merge them with our new understandings and new technologies to get things that can work now and be viable and functional. Regardless, farming is always going to be a labor-intensive sort of thing if you're doing it on a small scale. You're going to have to work. But I think luckily there's a lot of younger people that want to embrace that. They see that as something that is vital, that something that feeds their soul. I remember going to NOFA conferences back in the 90s, and all these old organic farmers here in New England bemoaning the fact they didn't see any younger people coming along and replacing them. I was at the New Hampshire NOFA conference about 3 years ago, and of the 600 people there, more than 200 were under the age of 30. And that was a huge change. So we're seeing, at least here in New England, I don't know if it's happening, in other areas of the country, but at least here in New England, we're seeing a real resurgence of younger people that want to do this. And I think they see a viable way to do it by working hard, but by taking the sorts of things we know today and incorporating them with the past. So one example, let me just give an example of the Seeds of Solidarity farm down in Orange, Massachusetts. That is an organic produce grower. He grows 2 acres of produce, but one farmer farms that all by himself without any mechanization at all. He has no farm equipment, no rototillers, he doesn't use any petroleum or anything. And the way he does it is his whole operation is no-till. He doesn't turn the soil. So when Ricky Bruck bought this parcel of land, he got it from the Mount Grayson Land Trust. It was the first parcel that land trust decided to conserve for agricultural purposes, even though it was no longer agricultural land, it was forest land. He bought this parcel. There was only about a half an acre of open land in the middle of it, which was the yarding area for the last logging operation that had grown up into young trees and shrubs. He says, all right, I'm going to start my gardens here, but I don't want to turn the soil over. He said, I've never seen anywhere in the world where the soil is naturally turned over every year. Why would we do that? Why would we keep disturbing that system that will succeed through time, get more complex, store more and more carbon, hold nutrients more and more tightly? Why would we keep turning it over every year? So he thought, okay, I have to somehow cut down all this vegetation, and then I have to kill it off. So he's thinking, all right, I guess I'm going to cover it with black plastic. And he didn't like that idea. He didn't like the idea of using black plastic, but in the town of Orange, where he was working this land, there used to be the bedroom factory, a furniture store. And he saw these huge piles of cardboard in the back, and he thought, wow, I wonder if I just clip everything down, lay the cardboard over it, and put some mulch hay on it, if that will knock the vegetation out. And then I'll be able to plant through the cardboard. Sure enough, after about a month, he started checking under the cardboard, and it was full of earthworms everywhere. He saw them starting to decompose the cardboard, so he started, punching holes through the cardboard, digging out little pockets, putting compost in there, and they planted right through. He started that in 97, so it's been almost 20 years. And he can work those 2 acres just with his physical labor because he doesn't have any weed problems. He never weeds. All he does is plant and harvest. His soils have been tested as the richest soils in the state of Massachusetts, because they've never been turned now for 18 years. And they started very poor. His forest was red oak and mountain laurel, which is indicative of very dry, nutrient-deprived forests. But not only that, he's cataloging what he's growing. He's getting more weight in produce per acre than any farm in the state. And he does it without any inputs besides maybe, 1,000 kilocalories of his labor every day. Now, he's not devoid of technology. He uses hoop houses, high tunnel hoop houses, because that can moderate the growing environment, can elongate the season, and can mitigate against, these very heavy deluges we get in the can cause plant damage. And he runs, since there's some hoop house, he has to have irrigation, he runs those off of a photovoltaic system. So he's not devoid of technology, but he's using appropriate technology, and his energy inputs into that operation are minuscule, and yet producing a lot of food. So he's a model. He can show he can do that. And it's not,
Does he still have cardboard?
he still has cardboard. Now,
He's got the supply.
he's got the supply still. Now, the question becomes, if cardboard becomes gone, then what does he do? I don't know. He'll probably figure that out. But he's not killing himself in this, because he's profitable. But basically, he works through that growing season hard, but then he's pretty much off from mid-November to mid-February. And that's just time for the family. So they spend a lot of time as a family during that time, and he reaps the benefit of that. So I think it's a matter of not going back, but taking what's worked in the past, merging with new technologies and new understanding, and creating systems that are more viable for today. But I do think we need to move backwards towards more smaller scale, less mechanized systems. I'm not saying we get rid of mechanization, they're going to need it in some areas, but we've gone so far in that direction, we need to come back, because we're using up huge amounts of energy in our supply and distribution systems.
Well, because we need cities.
Is what?
It's cities.
Cities, well, yeah, cities are a real conundrum.
But they use less energy.
They do. But in the perfect world, what you'd have is you'd have moderate-sized cities, maybe 500,000 people or so, surrounded by a rural landscape. You wouldn't have any of the suburbia in between. That would be the perfect model, because cities are our most energy efficient places for people to live. I mean, New Yorkers have the lowest sort of environmental footprint of any citizens in this country. They use mass transportation. They live in big buildings that have small surface area to volume ratios, so they're very energy efficient. The problem is when you get cities that are 10, 12, 20 million people, those are really problematic. And so what we need, again, is more, that's too concentrated. You need more decentralized cities where you're around 500,000 people, maybe 1 million people, surrounded by rural areas. I don't know how we get around that. That is a real big problem. Yeah, I would agree, and I don't think we're talking about reinventing the wheel.
No.
And we have a lot of tried-true practices we can use. Like I said, incorporate them with our evolving understanding of things, new technologies. So all the models that we can bring to bear that really work, we ought to be looking at.
So I feel like one of the largest externalities of a too broadly globalized or corporatized or industrialized system is a sense of one's alienation from their own identity. And I think that a more localized system could have as its basic course the reclamation of personhood.
Yeah, so I would agree with that. So the comment was that one of the things that's happened with globalization is loss of identity. And yeah, that's absolutely true, because what we've done is we've really homogenized everything. So, if you can go over to Beijing, China and see McDonald's, I mean, it's making Beijing, China just like here. So we have our really large scale network in this way has homogenized things, and in that process we've lost local identity. It used to be, you go to a different city, you would have different sorts of foods and other things. It's not really the same anymore. It's become much more homogeneous. So that is true, I'd say.
About 5-6 years ago, we had a class called Energy and the Environment. And I'm wondering about what other classes and initiatives are happening to educate this type of idea at a younger level. How that, also if you know how that is related to policy and education policy and
In terms of, courses that are like, she was mentioning that when she was in high school, she had a course, Energy and the Environment. Are there other, classes like this that are happening? How does this relate to state educational policies? Certainly, a lot of sort of the guidelines of things that we taught can fall in under a course like that. So a course like that can easily be taught and still meet the various, guidelines that states have. There are a number of schools that are teaching courses like this. I mean, it's still a very small minority, but hopefully it'd increase. I mean, I really think if we could get all high school students exposed to the second law of thermodynamics and its implications, and just exposed to a principle like complexity and self-organization, boy, it really changed your whole paradigmatic view of how you see the world and how you see systems. And, we've been really trained in a linear reductionistic system, which, has been marvelous in a lot of our knowledge, but really doesn't help us when we're addressing the system, because, we tend to look at, all right, we'll solve this thing by tinkering in the parts, and that often just makes the situation worse. So, it'd be really important to have more of this happening.
Since you mentioned that, I'm wondering what actually represents a linear system, because if I try to find one in nature, there isn't.
Well,
so there's Newtonian physics, maybe geometry, in a certain way, because it's all predictable and reversible, and all the instances apply to everything and the like. But the difference when you introduce a second law is that there's indeterminacy. You don't have certainty of an outcome. But
Well,
what is a linear system?
Well, I mean, that's what I said in the very first session. I said it may just be a construct. But a linear system would be one where the parts interact in a lockstep way. None of the systems we interact with work like that. None of them. They're all complex. So, I said like a clock with gears may be a linear system. But the problem is that these systems, as they're nested within other systems, are influenced by those bigger systems, and their predictability can be altered by that. So it may just be a mental construct that they really don't exist. But we've been trained to look at the world in that way. And you can see our education system set up like that. If you're working with complexity, you're looking at ways to integrate and synthesize. If you look at our educational system, well, for a long time, we've taken knowledge, we've broken it up into disciplines. We've separated out, philosophy and science and mathematics and history. And then we broke it down even further. The further you go into your academic training, the more and more specialized you get. So in science, we have the natural sciences, we have the physical sciences. If you go to the natural sciences, you can go bore way down as you're going into your PhD. Now, that can give rise to an incredible amount of knowledge. But we're not very well versed in how to take all that disparate information and link it back up to form a whole system. And so, even though these things may not exist, this is the way we look at the world.
Like Gaia theories invented in the 70s versus took a long time to get out of it, specialization, so it's seeing relationship.
Exactly.
So what you're just describing is a specialization without integration, and it's the opposite of the self-organizing.
It is.
And a lot of our, our political system and our economic and so on and so forth are follow that model. So going back to what's going to modify our behavior, some of it, like you say, well, it has to come from the bottom up, and some of that's happening, but sometimes, like some of the impetus is going to come from system collapse in those linear or those less complex systems. And then you can't go rely on those anymore, and we're gonna have to, you know, kind of look around us and see the world for how it really is.
I mean, there's no doubt, when we start getting feedback that can completely alter our current systems, yeah, we're gonna have to change, because it's gonna be forced upon us. In a way, that's not part of the system, that's coming from a larger system that we're sort of nested within. But you're absolutely right, that's, you know, if we don't, believe me, if we don't make significant change in the way we behave as a species, it will be forced upon us. It won't be a question of whether it's gonna happen or not, it will happen. And I'm pretty confident if we continue the route we've gone, it's gonna happen in this century. You know, if we just try to keep our trajectory, because you know, the more and more energy we consume, the more and more environmental degradation, and the feedback is going to get stronger and stronger, and probably most in the form of climate change, which will start dismantling the system. It will start taking it apart piece by piece. Now, you know, the thing about climate change is a little unsettling. You know, the dramatic weather we've seen this last 10 years, with now the increase of, like, all of a sudden superstorms, increase of violent weather, these deluges, droughts, you know, just really amazing events. That is all from our emissions pre-1990. We have a good 25 to 30-year lag phase in this atmospheric system. So right now, we haven't seen what we've already brought to bear. We're not going to see that until we get to around 2040, 2045. That's if we capped everything right now. So you can bet it's going to change dramatically, and it's going to start having big impacts. So, you know, we have got to change our trajectory, or it will change for us.
What's interesting is that in terms of feedback loops, we're not paying attention.
We're definitely not paying attention.
We're not paying attention.
You know, so let me talk about biological cognizance. Every organism out there is cognizant. All the trees are cognizant. Everything's cognizant. The fungi, everything. What biological cognizance is being able to take in cues from your environment and respond correctly to it. Everything out there has to be biologically cognizant. If it wasn't, natural selection would take it right out of the picture. You can't be out there oblivious to this. You don't have to have a brain to be cognizant. In fact, I think a brain is an impediment to cognizance. Because we are getting so many cues from our environment that we're just sort of ignoring. It's crazy. You don't even need to have nervous tissue to be cognizant. I mean, the best example I think I've ever seen was moving footage from Lynn Margulis's lab at the University of Massachusetts involving two single-celled protists, a single-celled paramecium and a single-celled didinium. Now, didinium is a predator of paramecium. When these two entities swam within about 60 cell lengths of each other, they both became immediately aware of each other's presence, probably from chemical cues picked up on their membranes. In any case, the paramecium, sensing a predator over here, turns 180 degrees and starts swimming away. But the didinium, being a faster swimmer, sensing its prey, went right after it and started closing in. As it's getting closer, the paramecium is sensing it and starts swimming erratically. The didinium gets even closer, the paramecium swimming really erratically. Eventually, the didinium is right behind the paramecium, and the paramecium, sensing immediate threat, threw off all of its cilia cloud, like the ink cloud of an octopus, to try to confuse the didinium. A very rash thing, because once it got rid of its cilia, it could no longer move. But it was a last-ditch attempt to try to save itself. The didinium wasn't confused. It dove through the cilia cloud and grabbed the paramecium and ate it. Now, it's a sad ending for that paramecium, but just a really good example of biological cognizance. And it's something that we, as a species, are not displaying. We are getting an incredible amount of feedback, incredible amount of information from our environment. It's like, oh, no problem, we'll just continue doing what we're doing. Yeah, so that's a real problem.
What about the seed of the mullen?
The seed of the mullen?
1,000-year
Viability.
yeah, in terms of, you know, maybe we should be thinking along that lines of like, how do we plant the seed for disturbance we can't plan for?
Well, yeah, I mean, 1,000 years is very forward-thinking. I think it'd be good if we could even just have forward-thinking 50 years from now.
Seven generations.
Yeah.
I was thinking 7 generations.
Yeah. Well, even that's 1,000 years, even way more than 7 generations. But yeah.
The biological impediments in your reflection on is these populations that occasionally occur that really consume their resources. So regardless of our interdependence and good ideas and all that, seems to me the overriding characteristic of the human population right now is that it continues to reproduce at an enormous rate. And certainly in this country and globally, we're just getting more and more and more and more of us. And there's less and less available for these other species that we're sharing the planet with. So they're going extinct. And our strategy momentarily is working for us in that we're increasing and spreading our genes around and really prospering in a certain respect. But the trajectory is clear that sooner or later there won't be anything left and our population will collapse. I wonder if you can give us some examples of other in the general environments, sort of biological environments where this happens, and just a sort of reference point for that.
Yeah, so you're right. So like our species right now is sort of in a self-reinforcing feedback loop. We're growing population, we're dramatically increasing consumption. Actually, I should mention just first, the population issue is now not our major issue. It's really the consumptive issue. I mean, if we really want to address population, we should have done back in the 60s. So even if we took the most dramatic steps on curbing population growth, we may be able to hold off on another 750 million people. But the problem is our population growth is slowing, but per capita consumption rates are really accelerating. So that's where we got to really put our effort right now. It's not so much in population, there's not a lot we can do there. At a global level, with certain countries, that's certainly a very important thing to be doing, like population, but at a global level, we need to focus on the consumption side. But in terms of an example, a natural example would be the introduction of reindeer onto St. Matthew's Island in the Bering Sea. After the United States in World War II pushed the Japanese out of the Aleutian Islands, they put in a radar base up in the Bering Sea, figuring that maybe the Japanese would try to come up through that way to make landfall in North America. And they had a crew of about 24 people stationed there. They wanted to have them have a food supply, so they introduced reindeer that they could, butcher and then eat. Well, that radar station was operating for 2 years. The war ended. They were pulled out, but the reindeer weren't, and there were no predators up there. So we start with 24 reindeer, and by the time we get into around 15 years later, that reindeer herd now has exploded to 6,000 individuals. And they've completely consumed the forage on the island. They went into a very bad winter that winter, and only something like 40-some reindeer survived. There was a die-off because so many reindeer went into it malnourished. There wasn't enough forage. They collapsed. So they went into a collapse. Interestingly enough, of those 42 members, all the males were sterile. And so the population was doomed and eventually went extinct in the 1960s. So that's an example of a system that underwent complete collapse. Now, that's unusual. In our natural systems, we'll usually see dramatic die-off if a population really exceeds the ability of the system to support it, but to see one go extinct like that, very, very unusual. But, we've also seen this happen with human populations. We've had lots of examples of human societies that have collapsed because they have gone beyond their resource base. So, Jared Diamond's book, collapse goes into that. Look at those.
What I value most about Myth Progress is,
Can you speak up, please?
yeah, what I value most about this course and the book is the power of ideas, because the ideas in it, for me, provide a framework, understanding what to do. There's a lot of work that has to be done, and there are some efforts that won't bear fruit. For example, trying to change every law is probably a waste of time. So what do we have if we want to have a stronger banking system? We have our own state banking laws, just to give one example. And we had less of a mortgage crisis here because of it. we also have less problem of waste and physical infrastructure that will have to be taken out. Whereas in much of the country, there are really dead areas that are overbuilt and will have to just, will be useful. We'll still have to think about taking up asphalt and concrete to restore our land, I guess, but not as bad as it is in lots of places.
Yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, this class, what we've been looking at is very sort of foundational scientific theory. It's not rocket science, it's very commonsensical stuff. Because I think if you do have that basic foundation, then you really have something to work off of. We do have lots of specific things we can do that this course didn't cover. That wasn't the intent of it. It was to give people the foundational stuff so that all those other practices have a place, a framework to fit into. They just aren't disparate sort of things out there. So that was the intent of it. I think we have time for one more comment if anyone has one.
We got a comment. Last week when I was walking out, I just glanced at some of the Nature Conservancy pamphlets, and there was one section that talked about eradicating knotweed, and one of the solutions was to use glyphosate. And I thought, wow, here's a group that's supposed to be, protecting the environment, and using glyphosate, which is one of the most. So there's some feedback loop that wasn't, really. I mean, there's no integration there of knowledge of the environment and toxins and so on and so forth. So it's just another breakdown. Even in a place where they're promoting, nature conservancy, there's some problematic aspects.
The impression was that glyphosate wasn't persistent.
I haven't studied it that much, so I don't have a definitive answer, but I think it does break down pretty quickly.
Well, there's an interesting article in New Yorker a month or two ago about conservation in New Zealand and the general question of invasives. And in New Zealand, they have introduction of quite a number of mammals, which basically the island didn't have mammals at all in their natural ecosystem, except a couple of species of bats. So the people in New Zealand that are most concerned about conservation of the ecosystem are developing systems to kill enormous numbers of what they call stoats. So they have mechanized traps that will kill maybe 20 a day, and it just keeps on going. And there's a hearty discussion in New Zealand about what really is is conservation. And for some people in New Zealand that look at it with great intent and discipline and backed by the full academic world, their definition of the best way to conserve their ecosystem is to kill billions of mammals. And this is, in fact, totally supportable from the notion of trying to save an ecosystem, trying to save diversity, trying to foster an integrated system and so on, and get rid of this low-level symbiosis. And within our own system here, we have plenty of exotics as well. And a similar argument could be made that to save, and I think the Nature Conservancy is probably making it, to save forest diversity, you have to come in with herbicides. So it's we have the easy answers are not there.
Well, in most cases, the horse is out of the barn.
This either-or sort of thing, with invasives, we're not going to be able to eradicate them. They're not going to get rid of those things. They're not going to do it. So it's really more like triage. We put our efforts where it's most significant. So areas where we have very endangered species, we work really hard to keep the invasives from extinguishing them. Areas where we have unique ecosystems, we do the same. And then when we have, the energy to work in other areas, we do that. But there's going to be whole areas we're going to have to let go. But like I said, eventually all these species will integrate in the system. We're talking about millennia though for that to happen. So, our work has to be like Noah's Ark, carrying our native species through until the systems adjust. But we are running over, so I'm going to stop it there. And,
Thank you so much.